In the suffocating heat of the New York summer, she waited, dressed in white, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the station clock. Each second seemed like a sentence. The agreement was for 4 in the afternoon. He would pick her up in his father's old car, and together they would run away to California. That was the plan, the promise whispered between kisses and stolen tears in the dark. But the clock ticked, the cars too, and he didn't show up. At 5, the crowd turned to smoke. The sky collapsed. In thunder, and reality fell upon her like a stone. He wasn't coming. And while she collapsed in the middle of the platform, on the other side of the city, he smiled in a bright hall, about to say yes to another woman, rich, influential, heiress to an empire he didn't dare lose. The same mouth that had promised to run away was now kissing another woman's hand in front of the guests. But there are promises that come back, and there are silences that scream when the truth decides to take revenge. What he didn't know was that her love wasn't the kind that dies easily, and that abandonment didn't kill that woman. It just transformed her. In the months that followed, he thrived on cold alliances, but she learned to use her own name as a shield. While he hid behind parties and diplomatic smiles, she planted roots in silence. And when they met again, unexpected, brutal, full of irony, he didn't recognize her right away. She was no longer the girl from the station. She was the woman in office he needed to win over to maintain his empire. And when he saw her calmly sign the contract he so desired, using the surname everyone now revered, he knew, too late, that the love he had scorned was the bridge he himself had burned. Karma doesn't shout. It signs in silence. If you feel that this story has something to say to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and come with us, because what is to come may speak directly to your heart. Forgive. It was supposed to be a new beginning, a breath of freedom, a leap of faith between 2 different worlds. She, the daughter of a nurse who never took a vacation, had worked since she was 15 in a small flower shop in Queens. He, the heir to a hotel chain, grew up amid formal dinners and rehearsed silence. They met by chance when she was delivering flowers for his parents' wedding anniversary ceremony. In the midst of the pomp, she tripped and dropped the orchids on the marble floor. And it was at that moment, while everyone was embarrassed for her, that he smiled, a smile outside of protocol. A small gesture, but one that she would never forget. And that summer, between hidden messages and quick encounters in distant cafes, the improbable was born. A forbidden, challenging, and real love. He said he was suffocating in that world. That with her he felt something real for the first time, that no amount of money could pay for the lightness she brought to his chest. Despite her fear, she believed him. Because when he held her hand, it was as if the world fell silent. He promised. He said that on the 17th at 4 in the afternoon he would come and get her, that he would leave everything behind, his name, his fortune, his inheritance, his commitments. He said he loved her, and that their love deserved to live far from those golden walls. And she, with her heart pounding, got ready as if it were the final scene of a movie. She put on the white dress her mother had worn at the wedding, which she had lovingly kept, in a trunk. She wrote a farewell letter and left it on the table at the flower shop. She changed her cell phone number and deactivated her social networks. She bet everything on what she felt, on what she believed to be true love. On the way to the station, she felt like the whole world was conspiring for that moment. The sun seemed more golden, the birds sang loudly, and even strangers smiled at her as if they knew. She sat on the bench closest to the exit, looking at each car that stopped. Her hands were sweating, her heart was racing. 4 o'clock, nothing. 4:10, nothing. 4:20, people came and went. 4:40. She looked at her cell phone, even though she knew he wouldn't call. That was what they had agreed on, a meeting without traces, with no chance of being stopped. At 5, the train left, and with it the rest of their hope. There was no explanation. There was no message, no note, no apology. Just silence. And the white dress, now wrinkled, stained with a love that she no longer knew had existed in a suit. Meanwhile, the city continued its brutal routine, and on the other side of her, a hall received the most important guests from the business elite. He was there, smiling, impeccable, with his hand intertwined with another woman. The flashes recorded the newlyweds kissing, while the bride showed off her wedding ring as if it were a trophy. He did what was expected, what his family demanded. He married the person who would guarantee him more land, more contracts, more stability, but the universe takes note. Time keeps track, and love, when betrayed, becomes a force that transforms. She didn't cry for long, because something inside her woke up. And that girl in love died at the station. The woman who was born in her place? He would still meet her, and not in the way he imagined. The silence of the station became a memory, a kind of ghost that haunted her less with each dawn, until it became just a memory, bitter but incapable of paralyzing her. In the days that followed, she walked as if she were picking up her own pieces, without haste, without drama. She exchanged her white dress for an old sweatshirt, but her eyes kept the same firmness of someone who had been betrayed and survived. She didn't go back to the flower shop. She took a job as a receptionist at a small design firm in Brooklyn. The pay was low, but there she could start over without questions. No one knew about her past, and she didn't need to explain the reasons why she never trusted clear eyes or whispered promises again. She had stopped waiting, and that was exactly when she began to be seen. She was efficient, quick, and polite. In a short time, she became a role model for her colleagues. Her boss began to delegate tasks beyond what was expected, and she took on the task naturally. Not because she wanted to impress, but because she needed to keep her mind occupied. It was during one of these tasks that she had to coordinate a corporate event, and there, while dealing with suppliers, customers, brands, and negotiations, she discovered a skill she never knew she had. She was strategic. She communicated accurately. She had tact. In less than a year, she was promoted, and little by little, places that previously seemed unattainable began to open doors without her having to force their way in. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, he struggled to keep his smile on in the photos. The marriage that seemed perfect in the media was, on the inside, a cold coexistence between two strangers. His wife was beautiful, rich, and connected, but every conversation between them sounded like a business meeting. He tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing, that giving up that passion was nothing more than a test of maturity. But something was eating away at him, especially at night, when the house was silent and the bed was still cold, even with someone next to it. He thought about her, about the girl from the station, and he wondered where she was. But she didn't think about him. She had learned not to get attached to what never comes back. Her focus was elsewhere. She studied at night. She saved every penny. She helped her mother, even from a distance, and in silence, she climbed steps that her old self could never have dreamed of reaching. There was no audience for her struggle, and perhaps that's why she became so strong. Pain, when it didn't turn into anger, became fuel, and she used every memory of him as momentum. While he sought contracts and cold alliances, she created real connections with people who trusted her integrity, her vision, her calm. Until one day, a name came up at an important meeting. A group of investors was looking for someone with experience in crisis management and brand restructuring. Her name was suggested by 3 different executives from different companies. She didn't even know it, but her professionalism resonated. And when she was called for a meeting at a luxurious hotel on Park Avenue, she entered as usual. Firm posture, direct gaze, polite smile. Little did she know that behind one of the doors of that same hotel, the man who had sworn to run away with her was also preparing for a decisive meeting that afternoon. He needed a new partner to save his company, and she was the only one who could sign off on his salvation. She entered the room without hesitation, as if she had already walked through doors much heavier than this one. She wore a grey blazer, her hair tied in a simple bun, and a thin briefcase under her arm. She didn't need to impose herself, her presence was enough. Across the table, the operations director greeted her cordially, but it was when she called her Mrs. Vega that he looked up. There he was, at the head of the oval table, in a neat suit and a tired expression, the man who had once promised the world and disappeared without saying goodbye. For a second, time froze. His eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly, but she simply sat down, thanked him for the welcome, and began the meeting as if nothing was out of place. Because for her it wasn't. This was just another agenda item. For him, it was the entire past coming to collect interest. The name Vega was now a brand. She had founded a consulting firm that transformed bankrupt companies into market references. She was discreet, accurate, and sought after by large groups. But he didn't know that. In his social circle, the news that mattered was appearance, not substance. And there she was, more powerful than she had ever been, and more distant than he ever imagined she would be. He tried to hide his nervousness. He drank water, he crossed his legs, and finally, he smiled with that same charm as before, as if he could still pierce people with his eyes. But she didn't look away. She listened, she took notes, she asked objective questions, and she ended by saying that she would analyze the conditions with the team. Not a word out of context, not a memory leaking. Out of the corner of her voice. As he left the meeting, he followed her with his eyes, still absorbing what had just happened. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a confrontation, but a confrontation in which only he seemed affected. That same night, he tried to look for her on social media but couldn't find her. Her name was now synonymous with business, not exposure. He sent her a formal message, thanking her for coming. She responded with a formal line and a best regards. And that was it. For the first time, he had no control. He couldn't predict. He couldn't seduce. And that was when the discomfort really invaded him. Her lack of reaction was more painful than any scream. On her side, there was no euphoria or drama. When she got home, she took off her shoes, made tea, and sat down to review his company's numbers. She knew that this reunion would come one day, and she prepared for it, not with anger, but with work. Because, in the end, true revenge never comes as a scandal. It comes as absence, as silent success, as the calm of someone who knows they've been discarded but haven't lost their value. They've just been relocated to a place where they're truly seen. And now it was up to her to decide. If she would sign up, if she would help, if she would allow herself to be once again on the same path as him. The next morning she woke before the sun, as she did every day. The city was still asleep, but within her there was an energy that pulsed stronger than ever. She reviewed the proposal with a clinical eye, marked the weak points of his company, and outlined 3 possible solutions, each with projections of risk and impact. Her work was not personal, it was strategic. She refused to let her heart get in the way, although it was impossible to ignore the slight tightening in her chest every time she saw his name on the documents. But it wasn't pain, it was recognition, as if I could finally look back without falling apart. On the other side of the city, he hadn't slept. He spent the night reviewing old emails, as if trying to find between the lines the version of her he had known. That sweet girl, with hopeful eyes, who believed in love as a refuge. But the woman he had met yesterday was different, impeccable, firm, without a trace of visible hurt. And that disconcerted him, because he knew that, if the roles were reversed, he wouldn't have been able to bear the lack of explanations. He also knew that if there was still a trace of feeling there, she kept it locked away. The following days were silent, no contact beyond the professional, no emotional gap. She analyzed, negotiated with the team, adjusted the terms of the possible agreement. He, anxious, tried to control the narrative with his team. The situation of the company was more serious than many knew, and she was technically his last chance before the collapse. For the first time, he had no way to buy time. He needed credibility. He needed her. And for the first time, he was also willing to give up his pride for it. On Friday, she scheduled the final meeting. It would be the moment of signing if all parties agreed. He arrived early, as if afraid of losing something precious. She arrived punctually, accompanied by a lawyer and the project coordinator. The room was cold, with glass windows that reflected the city below, but inside the air seemed thicker than ever. He tried to smile when she entered. She just nodded. The meeting began. It was 45 minutes of adjustments, revisions, and exchanges of restrained glances. At the end, she pushed the papers to the center of the table and held out the pen. He hesitated. He took the object, but did not sign. He looked at her and said in a low tone, "You are different." She stared at him for a few seconds, then replied calmly, "I am whole." And she went back to looking at the papers as if she had no time for the past. He signed it. And at that moment, he understood that it wasn't just a contract. It was the final chapter of a story that he himself had torn up years ago. And now, by a twist of fate, or divine justice, it was she who dictated the terms of the new phase. He left the meeting with the papers in his hands, but with an empty heart. It was supposed to be a victory. After all, he had managed to close the deal he so desperately needed, saving his company from imminent collapse. But when he looked at the elevator glass as he descended the floors of that building, he saw reflected a man he no longer recognized. Everything he had built up until that point seemed to have been based on decisions made out of convenience, not conviction. And at that moment, he realized that he had lost more than a love. He had lost himself along the way. The shine of his success had faded since the day he left the only woman who saw him as a man and not an heir. She returned to the office as if she had just finished a job well done. There was no smile, no celebration, just silence. She knew that. Signature carried more than just clauses. It was proof that she was no longer a victim of her own story. She had won without having to hurt, without exposing, without demanding. She had won with dignity. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Because part of her still remembered the nights she dreamed of that man, of a small house far from everything, of simple afternoons and genuine glances. She had loved him, truly, and maybe that was why it had hurt so much. But the woman who was now signing billion-dollar contracts was the same woman who had once waited alone at the station. She had simply learned to keep her pain in the pocket of maturity. He, on the other hand, began to lose himself in desperate attempts to reconnect with the past. He reached out to mutual friends, tried to visit the flower shop where she had worked years before, now closed. He even looked for her old number, but it was non-existent, as if she had disappeared from the map, only to be reborn somewhere else. The new version of her was unapproachable, shrouded in elegance and silence. And that ate at him, because it wasn't rejection, it was absence. It was as if he no longer existed in her timeline, and maybe that was exactly what it was. One night, while attending a business gathering, he heard her name mentioned by another CEO as a reference in ethics and long-term vision. She was admired, she was listened to, she was taken seriously, and this brought him a pain he couldn't name, because he never knew how to admire her when he had it, and now it was too late to even be remembered. He tried to write an email, he deleted it, he tried to send flowers, he gave up. He knew that any gesture would seem too small compared to the implacable silence she maintained. She, in turn, began to reap fruits that had nothing to do with him. A social project she led won a national award, and her story began to gain attention. Not the story of abandonment, but of overcoming. She was invited to lectures, interviews, events, but she turned down almost all of them. She didn't want exposure, she wanted impact. Her name grew because her soul grew. And when people asked her if there was someone in her heart, she would just smile and answer, "I haven't found anyone who walks by my side without wanting to hold my hand." A few weeks later, she received a formal invitation to a gala event hosted by the New York Federation of Business and Urban Development. She would be honored for her work in economic revitalization in marginalized neighborhoods. It was an unexpected but well-deserved recognition. On the golden envelope among the names of the sponsors was also his family's seal, a small but symbolic detail. For a moment, she considered refusing, not out of fear, but out of emotional exhaustion. She was tired of having to navigate the past disguised as the present. But she accepted, not out of pride, out of coherence. Her absence would have meant more to him than her polite presence, but sometimes the universe wants us to be witnesses to justice that does not seek revenge but teaches. On the night of the event, she arrived with the discreet elegance of someone who didn't need to prove anything. She wore a dark, sober dress, her hair loose, and her makeup light. She walked as if she knew the value of each step. He saw her as soon as she entered. He was surrounded by people, but the world went silent. As if, for a moment, the music, the lights and the smiles bowed before her image. He felt his chest sink. She was so close and yet so far away. She looked at him for a few seconds and then looked away without any emotion. To her, he was just another face in a crowded room. During the award speech, the presenter mentioned her story of overcoming obstacles without going into details. He highlighted her intelligence, her ethical stance, and her sensitivity. She walked up on stage naturally, and upon receiving the award, thanked her mother, who always taught her to work with dignity, and the silences in life, which forced her to listen to her own voice. This sentence hit him like a punch, because he knew it was about him, even if no one else there knew. When the ceremony ended, he tried to get closer. He waited for the right moment, but when he finally got closer, she was no longer there. She left the hall and stood on the stairs, trying to understand how it was possible to still carry that weight, how it was possible to feel so much for someone who was now just a shadow. But maybe it wasn't love she felt, maybe it was regret, because he would never know who she had truly become, and she, in turn, would never again open the door to the person who had left her waiting at an empty station. At home, she kept the trophy on a modest shelf, next to a picture frame of her mother. She sighed, not out of longing, but out of relief. Life was at peace, and in that moment, she knew she had reached the point she had always sought. Not to beat someone, but to no longer need to beat them, because true triumph was internal. It was knowing that even when she was hurt, she was never left whole. The morning after the event, he woke up with a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. Emptiness. The house was big, breakfast was served on time, all the appointments were lined up in the diary, but nothing made sense. He looked at his wife, elegant, perfect in the eyes of the world, and felt only distance. She talked about investments, about a trip to Aspen, about a new architect to renovate the garden. He responded in monosyllables while his mind returned without permission to the speech of the woman he had ignored. The phrase about the silences of life echoed more strongly than any vow he had made on that purchased altar. He tried to convince himself it was just nostalgia, but it wasn't. It was a realization. The kind of pain that only comes when the soul realizes it has chosen the shortest, safest path and left behind the only one that led to true peace. He sought her out again. He sent flowers to her office with a simple card. "I'm sorry for everything. You deserve the world." He got no response. The secretary returned the bouquet, untouched, along with a hand-signed note. "Please keep communications professional. Thank you, E. Vega." And it was as if the ground had fallen away beneath his feet. From that moment on, something in him began to crumble. Meetings lost their sparkle. Social events became unbearable. Family dinners were a succession of empty conversations. For the first time, he began to look at his own story and realized that he was a supporting character in his own life. He had everything the world applauded, but nothing that truly fulfilled him. And the more he understood this, the more he admired the woman who, even without wanting to, had become a mirror, a reflection of what he could have been, if he had had the courage. She, in turn, was immersing herself in new projects. She was leading a social impact campaign that connected women entrepreneurs in marginalized regions with major investors. She was the missing bridge. She spoke little about herself, but she was listened to with reverence. He had respect, independence, and purpose. Sometimes she remembered him, yes, but as someone remembers a past winter, a cold that seemed endless, but that ended, and she held on until spring. One afternoon, during a charity event, a young intern spoke emotionally about her speech at the event. He said it inspired him to change majors and pursue his dreams. She smiled warmly, thanked him but said nothing, because she knew that the impact wasn't coming from what she said, it was coming from who she had become. And at that point in her life, she already understood that her best response to the past was to continue to blossom in silence. The news came without warning, like so many others that changed the course of a life. His company was on the brink of bankruptcy. Even with the signed agreement, past mistakes, poorly drawn contracts, and hasty decisions took their toll. Within a few months, the inherited fortune crumbled before the eyes of shareholders. The newspapers announced the collapse as if they were describing the end of an era. Images of him with a dejected expression, refusing interviews, spread through the media like a sad spectacle of decline. He, who had always prided himself on controlling the narrative, was now just another name amid the corporate scandals that were piling up. In the financial news, she heard the news during a call with a client. She didn't react with surprise or satisfaction. She just listened, thanked him for the warning, and went on with her day. Her heart didn't beat faster, her breathing didn't falter. It was as if that name no longer had power over her emotions. It wasn't coldness, it was maturity. She had already forgiven deep down, but she would never forget what it was like to be forgotten at the most crucial moment. Time had done its part. It had healed. While he was slowly dismantling himself, trying to sell shares, get rid of real estate, and at least preserve public dignity, she was invited to speak at Columbia University about resilience and business strategy. When he went on stage, he didn't use figures or technical jargon. He spoke from the soul. He told her how silence can be educational, how certain falls are, in fact, liberations. She received a standing ovation, not for having defeated anyone, but for having defeated herself, her fear, her grief, her doubt. His wife, upon realizing his financial ruin, was the first to walk away. She moved to another state with her children, hired lawyers, and promised not to bear the burden of his bankruptcy. The alliances that had supported his facade crumbled like thin glass. Friends disappeared, invitations stopped. The man who had once traded love for convenience now faced, alone, the rubble of his choices. The same old car that he should have driven away with her in now sat in the garage gathering dust as a symbol of everything he had never experienced. She, even though she was aware of all this, did not seek to know the details. She did not comment, did not judge, did not mock. Her silence continued to be the loudest response, but on very quiet nights sometimes she remembered, not him, but the girl who believed, and she smiled tenderly for not having betrayed her, for having taken care of her until she became the woman she was now. Because that was the greatest turnaround, not his failure but her rebirth. Time passed, and the bankruptcy scandal was replaced by other headlines. He disappeared from the covers, from events, from circles. He moved to a smaller house on the outskirts of Yonkers, away from the spotlight, away from the noise. There he learned to make his own coffee, to tidy his own room, to cook scrambled eggs that no one else would try. The days grew long, and the silences even longer. He was no longer sought after, nor remembered. The phone rang only for collections, and even then there was no resentment, just the muffled sound of a life that no longer echoed anywhere. He spent his afternoons looking out the window, watching children walking by with backpacks on their backs, couples laughing with grocery bags, everything that money never gave him, or that he never knew how to appreciate when he had it. On one of those afternoons, he found an old wooden box stored in the back of the closet. Inside, he found photos of his parents, old newspaper clippings about hotel openings, event invitations, and at the bottom, folded and yellowed, a letter. The only one she had left at the flower shop on the day of the escape that never happened. He read it with trembling hands. If you're reading this, it's because you didn't come. And if you didn't come, it's because you never loved me like I thought you would. But even so, thank you for making me dream. He cried for the first time in a long time. Not because of the material losses, but because he had abandoned someone who, even though she was hurt, knew how to be grateful. That letter was the epitaph for everything that could have been, and there was no going back. On the other side of the city, she was coordinating a new phase of her social project. She had founded an institute that supported young women in situations of neglect, offering professional training, scholarships, and, most importantly, listening. She did not use her past as a flag, but as a compass. Each decision was made with the sensitivity of someone who knew the pain of being neglected, and with the strength of someone who overcame it alone. One of the pillars of the institute was named after her mother, the other after the flower shop where it all began. Roots she never forgot. One night, one of the young women in the program wrote to her saying, "Thank you for not giving up on life, even when everything seemed meaningless. Your story saved me." She read it with tears in her eyes, not because I was still in pain, but because I now understood the purpose of it all. Her suffering had not been in vain. What had once been abandonment was now shelter. What had once been silence was now voice. She never saw him again. Not in newspapers, not on social media, not by chance. But deep down she knew he still thought about her. Not with anger, but with the kind of regret that comes with realizing, too late, that true love cannot be replaced. And that there are choices that cannot be undone. They only leave traces. It was a cloudy autumn afternoon when she received the invitation that, for a second, made her hesitate. An international conference on business transformation and social impact in Boston, curated by one of the groups that had once belonged to his family. Her name was among the keynote speakers. She knew there was a real chance he would be there, even though he no longer held an executive position. Life took turns, and this was one of the most symbolic turns, but she accepted. Not because she was provoked, because she had a mission. She no longer lived to avoid ghosts, but to illuminate other paths. The trip was peaceful, without anxiety, without any past on her mind. She arrived at the hotel with the ease of someone who knew who she was. On the opening night, she walked through the lobby among executives, journalists, young entrepreneurs. Everyone wanted to greet her, take pictures, listen to her advice. She smiled kindly, but at a distance. She knew how to filter intentions. Until, near the exit, among a group of businessmen discreetly separated, she saw him, sitting, aged, grey hair, simpler suit, gaze downcast. He didn't seem out of place. He seemed tired. She didn't look away. She passed a few meters away from him. For a moment he looked up, and there they were. The time between them lasted only 2 seconds, but within that span, an entire story fit. He didn't smile. He didn't try to get closer. He just looked at her as if contemplating something unattainable. She just nodded slightly and continued, without haste, without tension, without a trace of desire or hurt. There was only peace. And that was the last time they saw each other. The next day, her talk ended the event with a standing ovation. She spoke calmly, clearly, with a firmness that did not ask for approval. At one point she said, "I have learned that not all pain is tragedy. Some are seeds, hard, yes, but they blossom over time if cultivated with courage." The audience fell silent, because there was something in her voice that did not come from books or theory. It was experience, it was soul, and it was impossible to ignore. He who was watching from the back of the auditorium discreetly wiped away a tear, not out of longing but out of acceptance. He now understood that he had lost not only a woman, he had lost an opportunity to be a better person by her side. And when he saw her there, transformed, admired, solid, he finally accepted that he had reaped exactly what he had sown: distance, emptiness, and a name that still pierced him like a blade. Not because of her, but because of himself. At the end of the event, she returned home to find the garden she had planted in her backyard. Roses, lavender, basil, sunflowers. Everything was growing there with order and beauty. She sat on the porch, looked up at the afternoon sky, and thought about how strange life was, sometimes unfair, sometimes generous, but always, always revealing. She didn't want revenge or an apology. "I just wanted to be who I was. A woman who wasn't chosen by a man, but chose herself when everything fell apart." The following months were marked by public silence, but also by intimate transformation. She temporarily withdrew from major events, interviews, and the spotlight, not out of exhaustion, but by choice. There was something inside her that was asking for stillness, a kind of reconnection with what was essential. She slowed down, began working more from home, and invested time in the institute and the young people she welcomed. She began writing by hand every morning, as if she needed to translate her soul into words before facing the day. And there, between the lines of her own thoughts, she discovered a new mission: to write her story, not as revenge, but as testimony. Not for the newspapers, but for those who, like her, had been left at the station by someone who promised love and delivered silence. He, however, had disappeared from the media and business circles and had become almost a myth among those who still remembered the family's former glory. Some said he was living abroad, others claimed he lived discreetly in a small town in the interior. The truth was simpler. He was still in Yonkers in a rented two-room house, living off occasional consulting jobs and poorly planned savings. Little by little, he had learned to cook his own food, wash his own clothes, and live with his own mistakes. Pride had given way to humility, which, although late, still made him more human, but regret was constant and lonely. One day he received a letter. It was unsigned, but sent from her institute. It was not for him, but for the supporters of the cause, with an invitation to contribute to scholarships for girls who had lost everything. He read every word as if it were addressed to him, and for the first time he made a donation without expecting anything in return, without signing his name, without sending a note. It was a way to, even if it was late, participate in something good, to be for once on the right side of history. She never knew that this donation came from him, and perhaps if I had known, it wouldn't have changed anything, because she no longer lived for old wounds. She lived for the healing that had become. Her life was now made of firm roots, true friendships, silent afternoons with a good book, and simple mornings with filtered coffee and fresh bread. He had few people around him, but they were all sincere, no poses, no facades. She was loved as she deserved, and most importantly, by herself. On a rainy weekend, she visited the old station where it all began. The bench was still there, the platform too, but nothing was the same. Not the air, not her. She sat there for just a minute. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The girl who had once waited with her heart in her hand no longer lived inside her. Now, she was a whole woman, and what was left behind was just the soil from which she was reborn. That night, after her silent visit to the station, she returned home with her thoughts at peace. It wasn't nostalgia that she felt. It was gratitude. Gratitude for having survived the abandonment, the humiliation, the raw pain of being discarded without warning, because now she understood. Some losses are deliverances. Some absences are doors to something much greater. And sometimes, those who destroy have no idea that they are unintentionally pushing us towards our true selves. She walked through the rooms of the house with a lightness that didn't come from achievements, but from awareness. Everything there had a story. Every plant, every book, every photograph told a story about her journey. And she finally felt that she had closed the last chapter of an old pain. On the other side, his life was moving along at a slow pace. He worked at a community library on the weekends, organizing files, cleaning shelves, and helping children with eyes full of discovery. It was little, yes, but for the first time it was real. There was no stage, no lights, no remnants of an empire. Just him and the chance, however small, of being useful to someone. One day, one of the girls at the library showed him a book with the cover bearing the name of an author he recognized immediately. It was her. She had written it, and publicly. It was a novel, based on facts. The story of a young woman who was left at the station by a promised love, and of how she had rebuilt everything with silence, with work, and with faith. He bought the book. He read it slowly, page by page. He cried, stopped, went back. And at the end, he closed it with trembling hands, pressing it to his chest, as if it contained all the words he had never had the courage to say. It wasn't resentment that was there. It was truth, and there was beauty in that transfigured pain. It was as if she had forgiven him without saying it, out loud, as if time had cleaned up the shards and left only what served as a bridge to others, and he knew then that no matter how much he tried to rebuild his own life, it was already unattainable. But it could at least be a mirror, so that he wouldn't make the same mistake again should love ever knock on his door in another form. She didn't know he had read it. She didn't need to. She knew the story she had written had a certain destiny, and the letter from a reader sent weeks later was the seal of that. Your book kept me from making the same mistake again. Thank you for turning your pain into my salvation. That was enough. That was everything. Because true healing isn't shouting to the world about what they did to us. It's turning into light what they tried to erase. And she had done that. On the last page of the book, a quiet dedication read, "To the one who once promised me a world and left me at the station. Thank you." It was exactly that abandonment that led me to where I was meant to be. It was the quietest and most powerful final point she could have written. Time followed its course like a serene river that, even after a storm, does not lose its direction. It was spring when she was invited to a low-key ceremony in the interior of the state. The event would honor community leaders who had brought about real and lasting transformations in historically forgotten regions. Her name was among the most anticipated, but the simplicity of the place, the intimate tone of the celebration, and the absence of cameras made that moment something different. It was as if life was finally returning not a trophy, but a hug. A recognition that did not come from the press, nor from the big stages, but from the collective soul of so many people who had been touched by her story. When it was time for her speech, she walked up to the microphone with light steps. There was no more tension, no more hurt, just serenity. She was dressed in blue, like on those old afternoons when she dreamed of running away with him. But now it was for herself, not for anyone else. She began by thanking everyone, her mentors, her team, the women who walked with her. And then she looked away to a row of chairs at the back of the auditorium, where a white-haired man in simple clothes watched in silence. She knew it. It was him, alone, without pomp, without a shield, but present. And for the first time, there was no pain in that reunion. There was acceptance. She took a deep breath, looked away, and concluded with words he had never heard from her mouth, but now came out as a liberation. Not all matches are defeats. Some are life's pushes to get us out of small places, and sometimes the one who disappoints us is, without knowing it, the push that makes us blossom. The audience applauded, but she didn't smile at them. She smiled inside, a smile that didn't ask for anything in return. After the event, while everyone dispersed, he remained seated, motionless, with his hands clasped in his lap. She walked past him, slowly. When their eyes met, he didn't try to get up. He just whispered, "You've become what I never knew how to care for." She stopped. For a second, her eyes filled with tears, not out of longing, but out of respect for what they had been. She lowered her head slightly, as if forgiving, as if letting go, and she kept walking, without looking back. Outside, the sky was clear. There was a breeze. There was light. A group of children were running across the lawn, and one of them bumped into her, laughing. There was too much life to fit into the past. She smiled at the girl, held her hand for a second, and said, "Go, run," because that was what she had learned, to run, even after falling. He watched her disappear into the pines and the people. He was no longer part of her path, but at least he could see her find her own destiny, whole, free, and greater than any story they had ever written together. That day, when he returned home, he picked up the book she had written again. He placed it on the table, and with an old pencil he underlined the last sentence of the dedication. After that, he closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, slept peacefully. She, at the same time, was watering her plants on the balcony without knowing. Because there are twists and turns that cannot be seen with the eyes, they can only be felt, like a cycle that ends, like karma that is fulfilled, like a soul that finally no longer owes anything to anyone. If this story touched you in any way, like the video, subscribe to the channel and get ready. The next story may be even stronger. If this story touched you, click the like button right now. It shows that stories like this deserve to be told. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting stories we're already preparing. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something similar? Write here in the comments. Your experience may inspire others. And don't leave without watching the next video that's appearing on your screen, because it has an even more impactful twist. See you there.